You'd like to give toe-up sock knitting a try, but you're not quite sure where to start? Well, we've got you covered. In today's tutorial, we're going to tackle knitting 2 socks at the same time using the magic loop method. So grab your favorite sock yarn, your knitting needles, and get the pattern linked down below, and let's get started. Hey Nerdy Knitter, Tanya here. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a master hand knitter, and the goal here at Nerdy Knitting is to help you become a more confident, adventurous knitter. And knitting socks will definitely build your confidence. Now we're focusing on toe-up socks in this video, specifically 2 at a time. We're knitting them both at the same time using the magic loop method. We're going to start with using Judy's Magic Cast On to cast on right at the toe and then work lifted increases to make a basic wedge toe. Then we knit the foot, and then our heel uses the Flegel heel construction, which uses just a basic gusset construction from the toe to the heel, and then a very basic round heel turn, which actually creates the heel flap at the same time. And it technically uses short rows, but we're just using decreases to create the shape of the heel. So it's very, very simple. And then we're just knitting a simple 2x2 cuff and finishing with the Russian lace bind off, which gives us a nice stretchy edge on the top of that sock. So you'll want to grab your favorite sock yarn and the knitting needles you like to use, or if this is your first time knitting socks, I will tell you what needles I'm using. Now you'll find a pattern link down below that walks you through this tutorial completely with 11 different sizes, from a little sock all the way up to an adult male size large foot. So every size in between you'll find in that pattern. You'll find it linked down below, so you can click on the link, purchase the pattern, and follow along and knit your socks with me. Let's go to the overhead and look at our supplies and the sock construction close up before we get started. To knit our toe-up socks, we're going to need some yarn, and I'm using PatricKnits yarn for this tutorial. This is available from Bis-Sock Yarns on their Bis-Sock Yarn base, which is a blend of 85% superwash merino and 15% nylon. You want to take that yarn, it was in a skein, so I caked it up and then divided it into 2 different balls. We need 2 balls to work with, 1 for each sock. We're also going to need 3 stitch markers. 1 to mark the beginning of round, and then 2 to mark the center of our heel. And we're not going to be doing any sort of setup round, but we want to have a stitch marker we can place over our needle right in the middle of our knitting, so locking ones work best for this. We'll also need our knitting needles, and we're going to need a long cord for this tutorial, 40-inch or 100-centimeter cord. You want it long enough to hold both of those socks and still have enough cord to work with. So I'm using US 1, that's 2.25 millimeter needle. If you have a favorite size that you like to use for your socks, then go ahead and use that. Or if you're new to sock knitting, then start with the US 1 and then see how that does for your socks. We want a nice sturdy gauge of about 8 or 9 stitches to the inch for socks that will last. Let's take a look at the sock construction itself. Now these socks are fresh off the needles. I just finished knitting them. They still need a nice good soak in a block, but let's take a look at what we're actually going to be knitting. We're going to start with our cast on right here along the bottom of the toe. We're going to use Judy's Magic Cast On, so we can start with a very seamless edge right there. Then we're going to work a wedge toe using lifted increases. Then the sock itself is just plain stockinette. I have this fun self-striping sock yarn. And then we have a gusset and a heel turn, but it's worked from toe up instead of cuff down. So our gusset increases start here, and you can see the lines right there. It's worked very similarly to the toe. We're using lifted increases to give us this extra space for our instep and our heel turn. Then we're going to do a round heel turn. Now this method is referred to as the Flegel heel, where you work this gusset and then you work this heel turn. But the heel turn actually forms the flap and the back of the sock itself. So instead of like a standard heel flap, you're doing this heel turn, and it creates that heel flap there, and it gets rid of all of those gusset stitches. But it's actually just a basic round heel. It just worked in reverse. So it's very simple to work. We're working short rows, but just with some decreased stitches, SSKs and purl 2 together, to get this heel flap, heel turn shape. And then the leg and the cuff are all in stockinette stitch, and then finishing with some knit 2, purl 2 rib. And of course the sock itself is fully adjustable. You can adjust the length as you go. And then the bind off we're using is, you can see it makes a ruffly edge here. This hasn't been blocked yet, but it's the Russian lace bind off. Very simple to work, but makes a nice stretchy edge, so that sock will definitely fit over your foot. So the first thing we need to do is cast on. So you're going to take your first ball of yarn, And we want to leave a bit of a tail. We're not casting on a ton of stitches. We're just going to cast on for the tip of the toe using a modified version of Judy's Magic Cast On. So about a third of your total stitch count. In my case, I'm going to knit a sock that has 72 stitches, so I'm going to start with 24 stitches, 12 stitches on each needle. So I need to leave a bit of a tail. We want enough to weave in at the end and then enough to cast on those 12 stitches. You're going to lay that over your thumb. And then the working yarn is laid over your index finger. And then you're going to grab the yarn tails underneath, sort of like what we would call our slingshot position. And our needle tips we're going to hold together in our right hand. And we want to put a slip knot. You can put a regular slip knot on this needle, or I'm just going to hold my needle like this and scoop it up and around, and that puts the first stitch on that top needle. Now we want to put a matching stitch on the bottom needle, so we're going to come up to the yarn on our index finger and just work a yarn over, and that's it, and that gives us 2 stitches. Now from this position we're just going to keep maneuvering down and up, adding stitches. So for our top needle we come down to our thumb, put a yarn over onto the top needle only, then we come up to our index finger, put a yarn over onto that bottom needle, down to the thumb, yarn over onto the top needle, up to our index finger, yarn over onto our bottom needle. And just keep doing this until you've cast on all of the stitches you need. In my case, I need 24 stitches, 12 stitches on each needle. There we go. That's my first 12. So that working yarn is sort of in between the 2 needles, and it's sort of going to be pinched in there, so it's not going to go anywhere. We have to repeat this process for our other length of yarn for our second sock. So I'm just going to move that out of the way, and I'll get that yarn tail. I'm holding those. I don't want to lose the stitches. I'm going to keep them up on my needle though. Find that tail, leave a length for weaving in and the stitches that I need to cast on. Get into that slingshot position, the tail's over my thumb, the working yarn's over my index finger. Put that first stitch on this top needle by just going down, scooping towards my body, and looping back up again. And then we have to put a matching stitch on the bottom, so we come up and yarn over onto that bottom needle. So we have 1 stitch on each needle. And I'm just going to keep repeating this process till I've cast 12 stitches onto each of these needles, and then I'll have the toe part ready to start for our toe up socks. That was my last stitch, and the last stitch you cast on is on that bottom needle. Just double checking. We're going to hold them together so we don't lose those stitches. Right now they are just loose loops. So this is what it looks like right now. I've just turned my work. My stitches, that last loose stitch is hanging in between. The tail is kind of dangling right there. We want to lock that in as well. So the stitches we want to work, there's the working yarn. We're going to work the stitches on that needle where the working yarn is attached basically. So we pull out this bottom needle so we can use it to work our stitches. And we want to lock our tail in place. So I'm going to just bring that around so it's over here and grab that working yarn like that. There we go. And that tail is sort of laid over the top, so it's going to get locked in. And knit the stitches on this first toe. There's the first toe, so we can just sort of slide them up. We're going to repeat that here. So find your working yarn. That's the yarn you're going to use. I'll put it in my right hand this time so you can see what I'm doing. And there's the tail. We want to bring that up and over that yarn so it can lock into place. And then we start knitting across. I'm going to grab that yarn and with this hand and just hold it there, that tail. We don't need that, but we don't want it to fall out because then our stitches will just fall apart. So slide this up on, and you can see the tail is locked in place, and I've got my working yarn in my hand, so I can start knitting across these stitches. Okay, so we finished. We're going to pull this up because we're going to work across those stitches next. There we go. So we're turning our work. And now that was just our setup. We're going to work across these stitches, but now you can see the yarn's attached back here, which is what we want when we get into magic loop. It was just that very first row. It's sort of attached to the stitches that you're going to work. So we have our stitches here. We're going to push them up onto this needle, and the yarn is attached to this back needle now. And I like to drape my working yarn right over the back and pull that needle out. That's what we need to work across. Now we've already locked in our tail, so all we need to do is take our working yarn and get that tail out of the way and start knitting across our stitches. Now this first one is that little our little slip knot loop, so if it's too tight I sort of insert my needle tip and pull it a little loose to get up some of the yarn in there so I can get into that stitch, and then just knit across. And that can be a little loose because it's attached to the tail, so we can pull it snug. Slide that one over. Repeat the process. I'll do this one with my right hand. So we're just going to knit across these stitches. And that is that slip knot, so I'm going to give that a little tug. Okay, and then try knitting it again. There we go. That's better. Okay, and this last one is loose because our tail is there. So we have finished. That's just, now we're all set. We've got the little cast on our toe. We've worked our first round. Now we're going to start working magic loop. So we pull that cord, the stitches up onto the cord. We turn. I like to make sure that well, we've got the yarn tail here too, but the stitches are draped over the back. Put the stitches up onto this needle and then pull this back needle out where the yarn is attached back here. That's the needle we need. We're going to pull that out and start working across. So we have our toe. We've started with that closed cast on, so we've got the very bottom of our toe. Now we're going to work our first increase round, and we're going to work an increase on each edge on this side and then turn and then work another increase on each edge on the other side. So we'll increase 4 stitches on this round. Now if you use whatever increase you like, if you want to work yarn overs and then knit them through the back loops, if you want to use KFB or make one, but for this tutorial I'm going to demonstrate the lifted increase. So over here we're going to knit our first stitch, and then we work our right lifted increase in this stitch right here. So we look for the stitch that's on the needle, and then we look for the stitch underneath, which is right there, and we're going to grab the leg of that stitch and pop it right up on the needle, and keep your finger there to keep it separate, otherwise you end up with sort of a drop stitch. You can lose the stitch that's on your needle. We're going to knit into that stitch, and we can let that drop off, and then we knit this stitch here, and that finishes our increase, and we have worked an extra stitch basically into that stitch. That's the right lifted increase. So I'm going to knit to the last 2 stitches. So here I have 2 stitches left. Now for this one we want to do a mirror image. We don't want to work it into this leg, so we need to work it into the other side, but to get there we're going to have to knit the stitch first. So we knit this one, and now if that stitch has moved, we don't want to pick up this leg because we'd be working right back into the same stitch and it would end up looking like a double yarn over basically. So we're going to go to the leg underneath that one, 2 stitches beneath the one that's on the needle, and we're going to knit it through the back leg because it's situated so that leading leg is in the back. So we want to knit it through the back and drop it off the needle, and that is a left lifted increase. It's just a nice alternative to your make one. Another resource you can have in your knitting toolbox. So make sure you're grabbing your working yarn. So we slid that sock over, and now we can work the same thing on this sock. So knit 1, and to work our right lifted increase, we get the stitch that's underneath the one on our needle, pop it up, keeping it separated from the stitches already there, knit into it. We can drop that one off, knit into this stitch, and there's our right lifted increase. And we'll do that on the other side. So we want to put our increase in this second stitch, but we have to knit it first. And then go 2 stitches, not this stitch here, but the one underneath that one. Pick that up and knit into the back leg. Drop it off, and that is our left lifted increase. So we have started our first toe increase. So pull those stitches up onto the needle, turn our work. Now because we have 2 balls of yarn, I like to alternate. I'll turn this way and then I'll do it a different way the next time, just so we don't keep, if we keep going in the same direction, we're gonna twist these yarns together. So you want to be careful of that, or you're just going to have to keep untwisting them because we've got the 2 balls of yarn here. So before I get started, I like to make sure I'm ignoring the tails, but the yarn, working yarn's draped over the back. And I can put the needle, the stitches I'm going to work up on the needle. The yarn is attached to the back needle. That's the needle I'm going to be using to work my stitches, and I pull that one out. And we work those increases again. Let's try. Let's see if I can do it with my right hand this time. So we knit 1, and then we work that right lifted increase, lift that stitch up, put it on the needle, knit into it, and then knit the stitch. That's part of doing the increase, is finishing the stitch that the increase was worked into. And then we knit to those last 2 stitches. Okay, so we need to get our increase into this stitch here, but we want to use the other leg on the other side. So we have to actually work the stitch first, knit the stitch, and that moves that down 1. So we don't pick up this stitch, we pick up the stitch underneath, and we knit into the back leg. And knit 1. And we have finished that sock toe, so we can slide that over, grab this working yarn, not the tail, and repeat the process 1 more time. So there's our, we want to work our increase into this stitch, and we want to work the increase in this stitch. So we knit that stitch and then get that leg that's 2 stitches below, knit into the back of it. That gives us our lifted increase. And knit. Okay, so that's the end of that round. So we can get our stitches on the needle, turn things around, yarn's draped over the back. Now at this point we've done our first increase. I'm going to just put a locking stitch marker right here, just so I know this is the beginning of the round. So my next round I'm just going to knit, and then I'm going to do that increase round again, and just alternate between those 2 rounds until I am at the full circumference of my sock. So in my case that is 72 stitches. So you'll be increasing 4 stitches on every round on both of your socks, on both of the toes, until you are at the stitch count that you need. So just keep doing that. Now I'm going to work a knit round, then I'll work that increase round again, increasing 4 stitches, and then work another knit round, and just keep alternating until I get to 72 stitches. So I'll see you back here after I've finished my toe. My toe's almost finished. I still have 1 more increase round to work, but you can see how that toe looks and how those lifted increases look along the edges. I think they look really nice. Makes a nice toe shape. But while we're working on the last few increases, I wanted to go over like the basics of magic loop. I think it's a little more difficult when we're right down on the toe. And now that we have more fabric, it's easier to see what's going on. But when I turn my work to start a new round, I like to make sure the yarn is draped over the back. At this point, your yarn tails for your sock are probably long enough so you can tuck them right down inside and get them out of the way. So when I turn the yarn, is back there hanging over that back needle. So our magic loop position looks like this. We're going to work across the stitches on this needle, the front needle. The yarn's attached to the back needle, the last stitches we just finished. So that's the needle that we pull forward to start working. So we can pull that forward. I just finished an increase round. And if you're not sure if you're on an increase round or a knit round, just look at the stitches that you've just finished. I can see I've got 2 stitches coming out of this one stitch right here. I just worked that increase. So I'm going to knit on this round. So I've pulled that needle forward so I can work on my first sock here. Now another issue that a lot of knitters get with magic loop is ladders between the stitches, or those gaps between the stitch back here and the first stitch here. And that happens because of this cord. Like you've got that cord, you've got the needle, and sometimes you have a lot of space in between. Like you can see they're sort of flopped apart. It's a lot of space between those 2 stitches. So when I'm working the first few stitches, I try to hug that cord right up against my needle tip. What I'm not doing is I'm not yanking on this yarn to make these first stitches tight. What that ends up doing is making this stitch back here very, very small. And it ends up being sized for this cord and not the needle tip. So when I try to get those stitches back up on the needle, I'm really having to shove them up because this stitch is too tight because I yanked on that yarn and I sized it to the cord. So I don't do that. What I do instead is I sort of try to pinch the cord and this tip together. I want to get rid of this big space. When they're just flopping like this, that's a lot of space in there, and I don't want that when I'm knitting. So I hold them together and I knit that first stitch, and you can see it's already sort of falling back even with my intention of holding it close. So when I knit this stitch, I pull that snug there. So now I'm trying to get rid of that excess space. I'm not yanking on it. I'm sizing that stitch for the needle, but I'm pulling it snug with that cord. So then I can just continue knitting after that. I'm not doing anything else to it. I just try to pull that first stitch pretty snug to the cord so we don't get any ladders on that side. So I'm coming up on the end of this first sock. I don't do anything special in the end. It's just that first stitch when I'm starting a new round. So I just finish the first sock. I can drop that yarn, slide it over. It's still going to hang out here. And I pull this one up onto my needle, grab that yarn, pull things snug. Not yanking on anything though. You can see why you need 40 inches of cord, because we need some cord on either side to work with here. So knitting that first stitch, which I just dropped off the needle, let's try that again. Knitting that first, snugging it up to the cord in the back so I don't end up with any ladders right there. That seems to be enough for me. I don't end up with ladders on this kind of a sock. Just snugging it up, but not trying to do it super tight. When you do that is when you end up with stitches that are sized for the cord, and then you can't get them up onto the needle, and that makes magic loop really tedious, trying to shove too tight stitches up onto the needles. So let's finish this toe, and we're going to turn, and I'll show you really how I do things to keep it as simple as possible without having to manipulate too many things. So last few stitches of this side of the sock. You can see like there's a lot of gap right there between those two, and that's normal. Okay, so I stop here. I pull this cord, not the one that I just finished. You don't want to accidentally pull your stitches off. Make sure you're pulling the cord that you just used. So things are pretty much there. And then I look, I don't want to have my yarns twisted, so I'm going to flip them this way so they'll untwist. My yarn is in the back, hanging off that back cord. It's not draped down like this in the front. What happens sometimes is you grab, when it's draped like that, you grab that back needle and pull it out like you would normally. And then you start knitting, but what you do with your yarn is you grab it from here and you pull it up and around. And you see what I just did right there? If I start knitting across, I'm going to have a loop around my cord because it was down here and I pulled it up and around. I've had that happen, happens all the time. You're basically making a yarn over. So when you come around and you're coming around to knit on the next round, you notice you've got this loop. It's not a stitch, it's a yarn over that you made from wrapping it around that cord. You can just drop it off. You don't have to do anything with it. You will have some excess yarn there. But what you want to do is when you're turning, make sure that yarn's draped over the back. And then pull this out. And then you can grab your yarn. It's not wrapped around that cord. It's just attached to that stitch in the back, ready to work right here. So I'm going to finish this round, and I've got one more increase round. Then we're going to talk about the foot. So I'm finishing up my last increase here, and then my toe shaping will be complete. So from this point on, we're just going to continue knitting in the round, nothing special. So it's a great time to use a self-striping sock yarn. We're just going to knit stockinette stitch until the foot is the length you need minus what we need for our gusset. We're going to start working our gusset increases, but after your foot is so long. In my case, I believe it is about 3.5 inches less than what I need for the total foot length. So I need a sock that is 9.5 inches altogether. So I'm going to continue working the foot of this sock until I am 3.5 inches less than that 9.5 inch measurement. But every size will be different, or depending on the length that you need for your sock and the sock circumference that you're knitting. That gusset is going to be a different length. Final increase right there. Now this method that we're using is called the Flegel heel. I'll link to the original blog post that talks about this heel construction. But if you don't want to measure that way, then you can try it on as you go, and you want to keep knitting your foot until you reach the point where your leg begins. Like you're going to knit along the foot, and then when you see that your leg and your foot meet, that's when you stop and you start working your gusset. But I've written it all out measurement wise in the pattern, so you can refer to that. Or if you just want to try it on as you go, you just keep working the foot from this point, just knitting all the way around both socks until you're at the point where the junction of your foot and the leg where they meet, or probably your ankle bone, about that area. And you can pull the sock on, give it a little bit of a tug so you get a little bit of negative ease, and when your foot is meeting that junction where your leg meets the foot, the top of the foot, then you can stop and we'll start working the gusset. Or in my case, or written out in the pattern, mine is 3.5 inches less than that total desired length. So I'm just going to keep working my striped socks until it's time to start my gusset increases. We're back now, and I've finished knitting the foot for the length I need, minus what I need still for the gusset for the full length of the sock. Like I said before, there's a few ways to figure that out. In the pattern, I have it spelled out completely in inches and centimeters, but that's based on my row gauge, which is about 10 rounds to the inch. If your round gauge is different, then that might change for you. But another way to check is to actually try the sock on. Slip it onto your foot, and when you can give it a slight tug and it meets that join where your foot meets your leg right there, that's where you want to start increasing for your gusset. So to do that, it's actually just like our toe, but only on needle 2. So right now, this is our instep. I'm back at the beginning of my round. I'm actually going to move that up so I can see it. It's over here on the toe, but let's move it up here. So on needle 1, this is our instep. This is the top of the sock. We're just going to knit. We're not doing anything different on this side of the sock. So I'm going to knit to the needle 2, and then we will work our first increases. So that's the end of my instep. I've just finished that. Now we're going to turn, and we're going to work across needle 2, our heel stitches. And this is where we'll start doing those increases. And it's just like we did for the toe. I'm going to knit 1. I'm going to work that right lifted increase. And then knit to the last 2 stitches on this sock. Last 2 stitches, but I need to work a left lifted increase. So I need to knit that stitch first, not the stitch that's just below, but 2 stitches below the one on the needle. Knit into the back of it and knit 1. And I'll repeat that for my second sock. So now that is our increase round, and we're back to our beginning of round. So my next round is just a plain knit round. I'll knit across my instep, and then I'll turn and knit across my heel stitches, and then I'll repeat those 2 rounds. I'll repeat my increase round, knitting across my instep, and then working those 2 increases on each of the socks along the heel. And as you can see, it's very similar to the toe, but instead of working it on both sides, we're just going to work it on our heel stitches. And we're going to continue doing that until we reach the full number of gusset stitches that we need, which is basically your full sock circumference -2. So in my case, I have a sock that has 72 stitches total. I'm going to keep increasing until I have 70 stitches just on the back. So my sock is divided in two, so I've got 36 stitches here, 36 stitches there, and I'm going to keep increasing until I have 70 on this side. But that's all spelled out for you in the pattern. So you just continue working those 2 rounds just like we did for the toe, except just increasing on one side instead of both, until you get to that number that you need for your gusset. And that will give us the rest of the length of our sock, as well as increase the stitches, so our sock will be deeper at this point, so it will fit over our heel. And then we will work our heel turn, and we'll actually turn the sock and start working the leg of the sock. I finished working all of my gusset increases, and when you're finished with that, the sock foot should be as long as you need it to be. If you slide it on your foot, it should meet right up to your heel, and then you can start working the heel turn. That's the next step. We're going to start working a turn for our heel so we can start knitting the leg of the sock, and we'll also be decreasing all of these stitches as we sort of form like the heel flap on the back of the sock. So the first thing we need to do is get set up to start working our heel. So we're going to knit across needle 1, both socks, knit across our instep, and then we're going to work just back and forth on our heel stitches, 1 sock at a time. So first thing to do is to get over to the heel, so we're going to knit on needle 1. Now the next part of our setup after knitting the instep is to place a marker. We're going to place a marker on each sock in the halfway point between our stitches. So whatever your stitch count, you're going to divide it equally in half. I have 70 stitches here, so I need to divide that and have 35 stitches on each side and put a marker right in the center. So now we're set up to work our heels. We've placed a marker at the center point for each of those. Now we're going to work just on sock 1. We can just slide sock 2 down out of the way. We're just going to work back and forth on the heel for sock 1 first. So we can slide that right down to the end. We can count our stitches after and get that back up on the needle when we need it. So I'm just going to put it right over there so it's out of the way. So our first instruction is to knit to this marker. So we're at the center point of our heel. We're going to slip that marker over, knit 2, and then work an SSK. This is how we're going to get rid of all of these extra stitches we have. And then knit 1. Then we're going to stop and we're going to turn. So this sock isn't getting touched. We're just working back and forth on our first sock. Now on the wrong side row, we have to slip this yarn, or slip the stitch with the yarn in front. And we're going to purl to that marker, which obviously is not very far. At this point we can remove it. We don't need it anymore. It was just to mark the center location. Now we're going to purl 2 more stitches. And now we purl 2 together. And then purl 1 more. And we turn. Now we're going to use the location. We have some gaps where we've been turning our work, where we're basically working short rows. We're not doing any wraps and turns or anything special to them. We're just using our decreases to close up those spaces. So on this side, now that we've been all set up, this is our process. We're going to keep repeating these next 2 rows. The yarn's in the back, we're going to slip that stitch, and then we knit to 1 stitch before that gap. If you look here, you can see there's an obvious gap right there between the stitches where we turned our work to work in the other direction. So we work to 1 stitch before. We want to close up that gap. So on our right side rows, we're going to work that SSK again. We're going to slip that stitch, slip the next stitch, and then knit them together through the back. And then we knit 1 more stitch. And that is what we'll do on every right side row to get rid of all of these stitches. And then we turn, and then on the wrong side rows, we have the yarn in the front, we slip that stitch. We're going to purl to one stitch before that gap. And you want to pay attention so you don't miss it and go right past it, but you can see it right there. There's a gap between those two stitches, so we're going to purl them together, and that'll clear up the gap and decrease a stitch. Purl one more, and then turn. So you're going to keep repeating those 2 rows. If you look right there, you can see that where that gap is. Just going to knit to that, SSK, and knit one more. Go back in the other direction. You can see already we've got this tiny little curve. That's our heel turn right there. That'll be sitting on the back of our heel as we work up the leg. So continue working these 2 rows back and forth until you just have a few stitches left on either side, and we've decreased all of these stitches, and we'll be close to our original stitch count again. I've worked my final wrong side row, and this is what I have right now. I have decreased all those stitches. I still have 2 stitches left here. And if you look, there's a gap, and I have 2 stitches here. So at this point, we're going to work one more right side row, and then we're going to stop working on this sock. Those stitches are decreased. You can see we've got our little heel turn here. But if we worked back in the other direction, we'd be stuck over here, and our sock that we need to work next is over here. So we're just going to work one more row. We are not back to our original stitch count yet. We're going to have to work a few more decreases, but we're not going to work them yet. So we're going to work our the same row again. We're going to slip that yarn, the yarn in the back, and then knit to that gap. And we're coming up to that gap, so we're going to work that SSK. And there's that knit one. Now we should be going back and doing that for this other side, but we're not going to do that. We're going to slide this one over, and we're going to repeat this whole process for our second sock. And then when this one is complete, we'll come back and we will finish up those final decreases. We actually still have this gap over here, and then we still have 2 more stitches we have to decrease to get back to our original stitch count. But we're going to have to worry about that later. So I'm just going to slide this down here. I want to separate my instep and heel stitches. So I'm just going to slide that marker in there so I know where that separation should be, and I can slide that right down over on the cord. It's out of the way, and I can start working on this sock. And we're going to repeat that same process. I'm not going to demonstrate it all again. We just did it. I'm going to knit to that center marker, knit to 2 stitches past, work our first decrease, and then work 2 stitches past at the other side, work our purl decrease, and then back and forth working those decreases along those gaps until we have just 2 stitches at each side. I finished my second heel, and I'm at that same point with the 2 stitches left, so I'm going to work that last right side row by slipping that stitch and working to the end and working our SSK and our knit one. And then at that point we're going to turn and work across the front of the sock and get ourselves set up to finish. We have a few more decreases we have to work at this point. After we work this one, we still have that stitch on this side to take care of, and then we still have 2 more stitches that we have to get rid of. We want to get back to our original stitch count, so we're going to do that over the next few rounds. So our final SSK and knit one, and we're now over here. We finished the sock. We finished both heels. We just have to get rid of those final decreases. I'm just going to use that marker to figure out where to divide my cord again. And I can take that marker out. That was just to keep those stitches separated. So we're going to turn. Now we still have more stitches to get rid of, but our heel is pretty much turned. And that's like the back of your foot right there, the heel. And we've started going in the other direction. We're going to start working the leg of our sock. And while we knit this leg, we're going to get rid of these final few stitches that we don't need. We want to get back to our original stitch count. So in my case, I want 72 stitches. I've got 36 in the front, and right now I still have 3 more stitches I need to get rid of back there to get back to 36 on this side. So we're just going to knit across our instep just like we have before. So that's the end of our instep. So we get our magic loop ready and turn our work again. And now we're going to get rid of that final gap stitch we have on both of these socks. So since we're working them from the right side and not from the wrong side, we are going to knit 1, pull that tightly, we don't want any gaps right there, and then we're just going to knit 2 together. Try not to split that stitch. That's better. Okay, so at this point I should have 38 stitches. I'm going to check really quickly. Yes, I have 38 on here, so I need to get back to 36, so I'm going to have to work a few more decreases. So when I'm going to work another decrease when I get to this side. So I'm on my last 2 stitches over here. I'm going to work an SSK. So now I should be at 37 stitches. I have 1 more stitch to get rid of, and I'm going to do that on the other side when I come back around. I'll work a knit 2 together over there. But for now, that's finished, and we're going to repeat this on our second sock. Now I am at 37 stitches, so I'm going to knit back around and we're going to get rid of that last decrease. So work across the instep, finish the instep, and now we are back on our heel stitches again. So we just have that 1 extra stitch to get rid of, and we're going to do that right at the beginning of each sock. So the very first stitch you're going to make is a knit 2 together, and that will get rid of that last gusset stitch, and we should be back down to our original stitch count. So at this point, it's just continue knitting in the round until the sock leg is as long as you want, and then you're going to start your cuff. We're going to work a knit 2, purl 2 rib. I don't think you need to see me demonstrate how to keep knitting in stockinette in the round or for a rib cuff. You're just going to work knit 2, purl 2 all the way around until you have a cuff that is long enough. And the sock leg, just continue until it's as long as you want. For me, I prefer shorty socks, so I'm probably only just going to do maybe like 5 rounds more in stockinette and then switch to the rib pattern that we're using, our knit 2, purl 2 rib. And I'll probably do that for a couple inches, and then we will come back and bind off. So this sock is all set. We are back to our original stitch count. At this point, I also like to check where the instep and the heel meet and make sure there is no like obvious hole right there. It doesn't look like there's any issue. If you think you're going to have an issue, what you can do on the next, when you get to the instep, is pick up the bar or a stitch on either side and just knit it together with that stitch. I don't have a problem there, but it's not really that difficult to close up a gap. You just pick up the bar between the stitches, like right here. You could pick up that bar right there, or you could pick up like the leg of this stitch here and pop it up and knit it together. We've got to work our knit 2 together on this sock. I do like to work these firmly. We don't want any gaps right there, but that should be enough to close up anything. But if you see that you're having gaps, then stop and test it out. Pick up the running bar and knit it together with the stitch and see how that looks. If it doesn't look good, take it back out and try it with like a stitch from the other side. Pick up the leg of the stitch beneath it on the other side and knit that together with the stitch on your needle. But you should be all right. I don't see an issue with this type of heel construction, especially where we stop and work that last. We don't finish the last decrease round. We actually start working in the round early, and that seems to close up any potential areas you could have a hole. So that is all we're going to do. We're back. We finished. Our stitch count is back down to where it should be. I worked that final knit 2 together. So now we're just going to continue knitting in the round. So I'm going to just continue knitting my leg. You continue working on yours. When I look at it right here, I don't see anything that looks like it's going to be a gap right there. So I'm just going to keep knitting around until the leg of my sock is as long as I want. It's actually quite long already. This is a nice long heel turn. It takes a while. So I'm probably just going to do a few more knit rounds, and then I'm going to switch to knit 2, purl 2 rib for about 2 inches, and then we'll come back and we'll bind off. So go ahead and knit your leg and your cuff as long as you want them to be, and then come back and I'll show you how to do the Russian lace bind off. Now we're ready for binding off. As you can see, my socks are pretty short. There's the beginning of my round. I can remove this marker now. We don't need it anymore. But this is totally customizable. If you have your yarn divided into 2 equal balls, you can just keep knitting the leg until you run out of yarn, or leave enough to do some cuff, so you can have a nice stretchy cuff at the top to hold that sock in place. But I like short socks, and I like just a little bit of ribbing at the top, so that's what I've done with mine. And now we are going to bind off. So this bind off, of course, when you're knitting toe up, you need to make sure your bind off is pretty stretchy, because that sock, that edge has to fit over all of the narrow and wide parts of your foot, especially around your heel and your instep where the things can get pretty wide. So we want to make sure that's stretchy enough to fit over that area, but also elastic enough to stay in place. So we're going to use something called the Russian lace bind off. It probably has other names, but that's the name I've heard it referred to. And it's pretty simple. You're going to knit the first 2 stitches. We're going to slip them back to the left needle. And sort of while they're there, I'm just going to keep my needles like this, sort of like we're going to do an SSK, that second step. We're just going to knit them together through the back loop, just like you would an SSK. Now we've got 1 stitch here. We're going to knit our next stitch and do the same thing. Slip them back, knit them through the back loops or back legs, and then knit another stitch, slip them back to that left needle, and then with our right needle go into the back, knit them through the back legs, knit another stitch, slip them back, knit through the back legs. You can always sort of just do it in one motion. You've got them on the right needle, you're putting your left needle into the front, and then from there knitting into the back legs. Knit one more, knit into the back. So that's all we're going to do all the way around. We'll end up with 1 stitch on this side, and then we're going to do the next sock. And that gives us a nice stretchy edge on there. So it's pretty simple to work. You're just knitting and then knitting them together through the back. And what that does, instead of pulling 1 stitch over the other, which creates a nice firm edge, knitting them together actually gives us more stitches along that edge, and it gives us more elasticity and stretch, and makes our sock a little bit stretchier at the top, so it will fit over our foot but still stay in place. Here we go with the last few stitches on this first sock. Knit them together, and now that sock, we just have the 1 stitch. We're just going to slide it over and let it hang out there and repeat the process with our next sock. We're coming up on the end of the first half of our second sock. And that final knit through the back loop. Okay, so now don't want to lose that stitch, so we're just going to sort of hold that on there. Turn everything around. Slide these stitches up onto their needle. And I just accidentally pulled mine out, so let me get those stitches. We have 1 stitch on each back needle. Still right there. And this one is right here, a nice long loop, so they're not that hard to pick up. Okay. So get ourselves in position, slide these stitches up, get that working yarn, pull this needle around, of course. Now we've got to get this stitch back up on the needle because we still need it there, so I should get that up there too. There we go. Turn that around like that. So now I've got to unwrap my yarn here. I don't want to make a yarn over or something like that. So get that back there. Get that stitch again. Okay, so it can be a little fiddly moving between the 2 needles. So we've got our stitch there. We're just going to continue knitting and knitting through the back loops. So here's our first sock complete. The last knitting together. Now we can just cut this, leaving a tail to weave in, and just pull it through. And now we've got to do that with our second sock. And our last one. Pull that through. Now let's weave in our ends. And then all that's left to do is to wash and block your socks. So because we're knitting a spiral tube, basically, we end up with this sort of a, you can see like the cast off, bind off edge is higher than that edge. We want to even things up a little bit. So we can do that while we are weaving in our ends. So just find the stitch that's beside it that you want to connect to and go under both legs of that stitch. just like that, and pull it tight. That closes things up. And then you just sort of bring it back down into the back leg over here, and that closes that gap, and then it puts our yarn tail to this side of the work, and we can just weave it in. I just like to weave it in down the legs of one of these columns of knit stitches. Then I circle it around that knit stitch there, and I'll go back up the other side. I'll do that with the other sock and then weave in the other tail at the other end. And that's all you've got to do. If you've made it this far, then you have successfully finished a pair of socks. You should be so proud of yourself. That's a huge accomplishment. But there's a lot more that we can discuss when it comes to sock knitting. How to choose the best sock yarn. All sock yarns are not the same. How to care for your socks. How to choose the right size for your foot. There's lots we can discuss. So I've put together a playlist with some of our past videos about all of those topics. So click right there, and I'll see you in the next video.